Hey, gang. Okay, one more wisdom of Grandpa story, but this one involves Grandma, and it does pertain to the music business in a way. So I used to love working with my grandfather because I was the oldest. When we had summer vacation, he needed me to help him out when he was doing contracting jobs. Very hard work, but I adored him. I didn't care. I didn't even care when he yelled at me because I never knew what the hell I was doing anyway. All right, so we would go to the job and often we would bring lunch. But if the job was close to home, we would go back and Grandma would cook for us. And Grandma was Sicilian, and boy, could she cook. So this one day we go back for lunch and Grandma's making us lunch and she goes, oh, by the way, Mrs. Smith called. Mrs. Smith was a local woman who was very wealthy, and she wants you to give an estimate on a new patio and a new deck, et cetera, et cetera. And Grandpa's like, sure, we'll go over there after lunch and I'll get all the measurements and whatnot. So we go over and we talk to Mrs. Smith, and Grandpa's taking everything down diligently. And he says, okay, Mrs. Smith, if you would please call my wife, I'll give her the figures tonight. If you call her tomorrow, and if the estimate works for you, we'd love to do the job. Okay, fine. We go back to the job that we were on. And we come home that night, Grandpa gives Grandma the numbers. Grandma's like, okay, fine. And we go back to the job the next day. We come home for lunch that day, and Grandma's like, okay, Mrs. Smith called. You've got the gig, you got the job. Show up as soon as you're done with this job and do the work. And Grandpa's like, cool, great. So we put in a couple more days on the job we're on. And then we go over to Mrs. Smith's, and it was like a 2-day job, as I remember. And we finished the work, and Mrs. Smith says, well, this is great, love it. Here's a check. Now, my grandfather was the kind of guy, he was such a sweet man, he would never look at the check. He would just fold it up and humbly put it in his pocket and say, thank you very much, we hope to work with you again. We go home, and he's filling out his bank deposit. And he looks at the check, and he's like, hey, he goes to my grandmother, hey, Nan, you're not going to believe this, but Mrs. Smith overpaid me by $1,000. Grandma goes, she didn't overpay you. You never charge enough. I told her $1,000 more, and she didn't even blink. So, while it's good to have a wise Italian grandfather, it's even better to have a wily Sicilian grandmother.